My mom works at NASA. She said. The whole class laughed until a badge walked through the door and changed everything. It was a Tuesday, just after recess, and the classroom smelled faintly of hand sanitizer and pencil shavings. Miss Lawson had barely gotten through roll call when she clapped her hands and said, "All right, time for our What My Parent Does presentations." One by one, kids stood up and shared stories. A dad who was a firefighter, a mom who worked at a local bakery, a brother in the Army, who technically didn't count but still got a round of applause. Then it was Talia Jefferson's turn. She stood slowly, holding a small index card with her name written in purple ink. Talia was one of the quieter kids in class, smart, but not the type to raise her hand just to hear herself talk. She looked around the room, locked eyes with no one in particular, and said clearly, "My mom works at NASA." For a moment, silence. Then came a chuckles. Then laughter, not the kind that explodes all at once, but the kind that spreads in waves, growing louder with each confused or amused laugh. Passed around the room. "Wait, NASA," someone blurted out from the back. "You mean like the space people?" "She's lying," another voice whispered, not quietly enough. Even Miss Lawson's expression was off. She didn't laugh, but her eyebrows lifted just slightly, as if she too found it hard to believe. Talia blinked slowly. She didn't yell. She didn't run. She just stood there, face calm, hands steady. "Yes," she repeated. "She works at NASA. She's a systems engineer." The word hung in the air like it didn't belong. Miss Lawson, standing near the board, gave one of those tight-lipped smiles, the kind that means we're moving on now. "Well, thank you, Talia," she said, already scanning her clipboard. "Okay, next we have Owen." Talia sat back down, ignoring the snickers and the nudges. Her fingers curled around the hem of her shirt. Her face remained still, but her ears were warm. Owen started talking about his dad's plumbing business, but Talia barely heard a word. She knew they didn't believe her. Not one of them. Not even the teacher. It wasn't just the job that sounded impossible to them. It was the person claiming it. A girl with deep brown skin, tight braids pulled back with a soft pink scrunchie, a hand-me-down backpack with a broken zipper. Her shoes weren't brand new. She didn't have fancy words or a loud voice. So to them, her saying NASA sounded like pretending, like make-believe. A piece of paper got past her desk during Owen's talk. A boy named Theo leaned toward her and said, "Did she clean the bathrooms there or something?" Talia didn't respond. She didn't cry either. Not then. But when the bell rang and everyone rushed for their backpacks, she stayed in her seat, eyes locked on the classroom door. For the first time, she wished her mom had a different job, something easier to explain, something people didn't look at sideways. Still, even then, she didn't stop believing it mattered. Her mom once told her, "Some truths are too big for small minds. You just let them catch up." Talia walked out of that classroom with her head high, even if her stomach felt tight. She wasn't embarrassed for herself. She was embarrassed for them. But what she didn't know was that the lesson wasn't over. Not for her classmates, and not for Miss Lawson either. The Jefferson house sat near the edge of a quiet road in Mobile, Alabama. Not flashy, but clean. Painted pale yellow with green shutters. The kind of place where the porch light was always on before sunset, and the screen door creaked a little when you came in. Talia walked through that door slower than usual. She kicked off her sneakers, tossed her backpack near the foot of the stairs, and headed straight for the kitchen. The smell of garlic and onions told her mom had gotten home early. Dr. Renee Jefferson was standing at the stove, stirring something in a big red pot. She didn't turn around right away. "You're late," she said, not harshly, just noting it. Talia pulled out a chair and dropped into it. "Had to stay back to wipe down the desks," she muttered. Renee turned, took one look at her daughter's face, and lowered the flame. "Talk to me." Talia didn't speak for a second. Her hands were in her lap, fidgeting with the sleeves of her hoodie. She looked like she wanted to say something, but didn't quite know how to start. "They laughed," she said finally. Renee didn't need to ask who. She pulled out the chair across from her daughter and sat down. No dramatics. No gasp or panic. "What?" "I told them you work at NASA." Renee gave the faintest nod. "And they didn't believe you?" "Nope. One kid said maybe you clean the bathrooms." Renee let out a quiet breath, not quite a sigh, more like a pause to collect herself. And what did you say back? I didn't. Miss Lawson moved on real fast, like she didn't want to deal with it. That part made Renee's eyebrows twitch slightly, but she kept her tone even. Do you believe you said anything wrong? Talia looked up quickly. No. Then don't wear their ignorance like it's your mistake. But they laughed, and that's on them, not on you. They sat in silence for a moment. The bubbling from the pot filled the space. Outside, a dog barked twice and stopped. You know, Renee said, getting up to stir the food again, when I first told people I wanted to work in aerospace. My high school guidance counselor told me to be more realistic. Said I should consider secretarial work. Talia looked up, eyes wide. That was in '98. I didn't argue with her. Just stopped going to her office. Did it hurt? Renee turned off the stove and faced her daughter again. Yeah, but also lit a fire. I wasn't angry at her. I was determined not to let her decide who I could be. Talia smiled just a little. She liked that her mom always found a way to talk real, but never dramatic. There was strength in how calm she stayed. You know, I could come to your class, Renee added casually. Parent Day is this Friday, right? Talia blinked. You do that. I get the day off anyway, and it might be fun. But what would you wear? Renee grinned. I was thinking maybe my NASA badge. And that black blazer you hate. Talia's eyes lit up. Okay, yeah, do that. Thought so. They both laughed, real, from the belly kind of laughter. The air in the kitchen felt lighter. Renee served them both bowls of stew and set them on the table. As they ate, she told Talia stories about her first job interview and the time she accidentally spilled coffee on a flight simulator keyboard. The stories made Talia giggle, and she no longer felt small. She felt lucky. Remember, Renee said as they finished, you don't owe anyone proof. But if the moment comes when you feel like showing them, just know I've got your back. Talia nodded slowly, cheeks full of food. And your badge? Renee smirked. That too. But she wasn't coming just to make a point. She was coming to shift the room. Talia just didn't know it yet. Friday came faster than Talia expected. All week, whispers still floated around the classroom like dust in sunlight. A few kids tried to apologize in awkward ways. One offered her a crumpled fruit snack. Another muttered, I was just joking. But most of them acted like nothing had happened. That was fine by Talia. She hadn't forgotten. By the time the morning bell rang, the classroom buzzed with anticipation. Miss Lawson had rearranged the desks into a horseshoe, making room for parents to sit and present. She wore a purple blouse and had put out a tray of sugar cookies. She clearly bought from a grocery store, a weak attempt to make the event feel festive. Talia sat near the middle, her backpack neatly tucked under her chair. She was nervous, but not in a scared way. It was a waiting kind of nervous. She hadn't told anyone her mom was coming. The first parents walked in around 9:15. A man in a mechanic's uniform, a woman in scrubs, a few moms with tote bags and Starbucks cups who smiled and waved a little too hard. The presentation started. There was clapping, light laughter. One dad told a story about fixing a sink that exploded. Another mom talked about teaching yoga to toddlers. Talia kept glancing at the door. Then, right as Miss Lawson was introducing the next speaker, it opened. Dr. Renee Jefferson stepped into the room. She wore that black blazer Talia couldn't stand, tailored and crisp. Her ID badge hung from a Navy lanyard that read NASA Johnson Space Center. Black slacks. No jewelry, except for a silver watch. Her expression was calm. Not smug. Not flashy. Just present. The room went quiet in a blink. Even the air felt still. Miss Lawson stammered, and this is... Talia stood up. This is my mom, Dr. Renee Jefferson. The teacher blinked, lips parted, then forced a smile. Right? Welcome. Would you like to tell us about your work? Renee gave a polite nod. Sure. Good morning, everyone. I'm an aerospace systems engineer at NASA. I work on mission planning, flight systems integration, and operation strategy for our lunar and Mars programs. Several heads turned toward Talia. A few mouths hung open. One kid whispered, whoa. Renee continued, not rushing. Her voice had a rhythm to it, clear, smooth, grounded. Most of my job involves designing systems that allow astronauts to travel safely in space. We look at everything from how they breathe to how data is transmitted back to Earth. She paused, letting it settle. I didn't come here to impress you, though. she added, scanning the room. I came here because my daughter said she told you what I do, and some of you didn't believe her. Silence. Talia's heartbeat was loud in her ears. She didn't dare blink. Renee stepped closer to the whiteboard and tapped on a printed diagram. She'd brought a real schematic from a past project. You don't have to understand all of this. That's okay. But the next time someone tells you something that sounds too big to believe, take a second before you laugh. Because brilliance doesn't always show up in the package you expect. She turned toward her daughter. And when someone tells the truth with pride, don't shrink it down. Let it stand. Miss Lawson cleared her throat. Thank you, Dr. Jefferson. That was very enlightening. Renee smiled and walked over to sit beside Talia, who was trying not to grin like a fool. The room moved slowly after that. The next parents stumbled through their presentation about running a car dealership. No one laughed. No one whispered. And Talia, she sat up taller than she ever had before. She didn't look around for approval. She didn't need it, because in that moment, her truth was loud enough to be heard by everyone. But what most of them didn't realize was that the woman they just met hadn't always been listened to either. And her road to NASA was filled with 1,000 moments just like this one. Before she was Dr. Renee Jefferson, she was just Renee Lewis, a lanky teenager with glasses too big for her face and notebooks full of diagrams no one else in her neighborhood cared about. She grew up in Baton Rouge, Louisiana, in a house with a sagging front porch and a mama who worked 2 jobs to keep the lights on. She knew early on she liked machines more than makeup. While other girls played jump rope, Renee built little contraptions out of broken fans and old cassette players. Her uncle once called her odd. She heard different. She took it as a compliment. At 13, she picked up a book at the public library about space shuttles and read it cover to cover in one night. By 14, she was teaching herself basic programming. She didn't talk much about it at school. She had learned quickly that saying I want to work at NASA would either get you laughed at or ignored. Her teachers didn't push her, not because she wasn't smart. Renee had straight A's in every subject, but because they had already decided what she was likely to become. You're really organized, one counselor told her. You'd be great as a receptionist. When she mentioned applying to a summer program for young engineers at Georgia Tech, her math teacher raised his eyebrows. That's pretty competitive. You sure you want to waste the application fee? She applied anyway, and she got in. That summer changed everything. For the first time, she was surrounded by kids who thought about things the way she did. Notebooks full of questions, curiosity without apology. She came home with a folder of blueprints and a sense of direction. But college was another uphill climb. At Auburn University, she was one of only 3 black women in the entire engineering department. In group projects, she was always the one asked to take notes instead of solve equations. Professors mispronounced her name even after 3 semesters. She didn't complain. She kept showing up. Renee worked nights at a diner near campus and tutored high school students on weekends. There were times she thought about giving up, not because she couldn't handle the work, but because it was exhausting trying to prove she belonged. One spring, after acing a thermodynamics midterm, she overheard 2 classmates whispering behind her back. She must have had help, one said. Maybe she copied from someone, the other added. She didn't confront them. She didn't cry. She just went home, opened her textbook, and started preparing for finals. When the semester ended, she ranked first in her department. No one could say it out loud, but they saw it. After graduation, she interned at Lockheed Martin. Then came the application to NASA, a shot in the dark, she thought. But her resume stood on its own. She got the call in March, while sitting in a laundromat with a basket of wet towels and 1 working dryer. Her mama cried on the phone for 5 whole minutes. From there, the real work began. The meetings, the designs, the late nights, the small stairs in conference rooms, the moments when she had to repeat herself 3 times to be heard. But she never stopped speaking up, because every time she sat at a console or sketched a new idea, she remembered a younger version of herself who only needed one person to believe it was possible. And now, when she walked into her daughter's 5th grade classroom with that badge swinging from her neck, she wasn't just representing herself. She was standing in for every girl who'd ever been told people like you don't do that. But this wasn't about proving anything anymore. It was about planting something new in her daughter that couldn't be shaken. The following Monday, something was different. Not in a fireworks kind of way, just small shifts, the kind you only notice if you're looking close. When Talia walked into class, she didn't expect a parade, and she didn't get one. But the air was quieter. Eyes didn't roll when she spoke. Theo didn't whisper. In fact, he avoided eye contact entirely. At recess, two girls, Kennedy and Samira, walked over to her near the jungle gym. They stood around awkwardly, shifting weight from one foot to the other. "My mom said your mom's speech was really something," Kennedy said, chewing her bottom lip. She sounded smart. "Like really smart." "She is," Talia replied without any hesitation. Samira nodded. "I looked up NASA stuff after school. It's kind of cool." That was all they said, but they didn't walk away right after. They stayed. And for the first time all year, the three of them sat on the bench and talked about something other than snack trades or slime videos. Later that day, Miss Lawson pulled Talia aside as the class packed up for dismissal. "I wanted to say something," she began, voice lower than usual. "About last week." Talia looked up, alert. "I should have handled that moment differently," Miss Lawson continued. "I should have asked more questions. Not moved on so fast. I'm sorry." Talia wasn't sure what to say. She wasn't used to adults apologizing like that. She nodded once, slowly. It was enough for now. But not everyone had a change of heart. Some kids still whispered, but they did it more carefully. A few looked at her like they were waiting for her to mess up, just to restore balance in their own heads. There was one boy, Dean, who muttered in his socket under his breath every time she walked by, as if trying to chip away at what she'd gained. Talia didn't flinch. She didn't shrink. She just kept doing her work. She asked more questions in class now. She raised her hand even when she wasn't totally sure she was right, because now, even getting something wrong didn't scare her. Not like it used to. One afternoon during group work, she overheard a classmate say, "She thinks she's better than us." Talia looked up calmly and replied, "No, I just know I belong here." There was no argument after that. At home, Renee noticed a shift too. Talia talked more at dinner, shared little things about her day without having to be asked twice. And she started drawing again. Not cartoons, but diagrams like her mother's. Rockets, helmets, star maps, and pencil. One evening, Renee found a post-it note stuck on the fridge. It read, "I'm going to work there too. Love, Talia." She didn't move for 3 days. But this wasn't just about confidence. Something deeper had changed in Talia. It wasn't about proving anyone wrong anymore. It was about standing in her own truth, knowing what was real, no matter who laughed in gym class. When the teacher asked them to write down a goal unrelated to sports, Talia wrote, "Engineer space missions." Just like my mom. When the teacher read it out loud, no one laughed. They just listened. But back at home, something else was stirring, a quiet moment waiting between mother and daughter that would anchor everything they'd been through. It was Friday night again. A full week had passed since Parent Day, and the house smelled like Renee's famous lemon chicken. Talia was at the kitchen table sketching a new design, something about a rotating satellite that used solar panels shaped like flower petals. She didn't say much as she drew, just occasionally stopped to erase or squint at the angle. Renee watched from the sink, drying a dish slowly. The way her daughter concentrated, tongue pressed slightly against her upper lip, reminded her of herself at 12, always building something inside her head. "You want to take a break?" Renee asked gently. Talia glanced up. "Almost done." Renee smiled and leaned against the counter. "You've been working on that for 2 hours." "I know. I just wanted to look right." She finished the last line and turned the paper toward her mom. Renee walked over and took a closer look. "Explain it to me." "Well, it's a satellite. But instead of keeping all the panels flat, they open up like this." She mimicked the shape with her hands. "So it can collect more energy when it turns, depending on the angle of the sun." Renee nodded, impressed. "That's smart. Where'd you get that idea?" "I don't know. I was thinking about sunflowers earlier, how they move during the day. It just kind of came to me." Renee sat down beside her, placing the paper gently on the table. "You know what I love most about that idea?" She asked. "What?" "You weren't trying to impress anyone. You were just trying to solve a problem." Talia looked down at the drawing again. "Yeah, I guess I was." They sat there for a minute, quietly, the kind of silence that doesn't need fixing. Then Talia spoke again, softer this time. Do you think they really believe me after you left? Renee rested her hand on the table. Some did. Some still don't. That's not something you can always control. So what do? You keep showing up. That's the hard part. Not just once, but over and over again. You speak the truth, even when it feels like no one hears it. Talia thought about that. Like you did? Renee gave a soft smile. Like I still do. Was it always this hard for you? Renee leaned back in the chair, eyes thoughtful. Sometimes harder, but I stopped waiting for it to get easy. Talia looked at her mother, not just as a parent now, but as a person. Someone who had fought through walls she never even saw. Someone who carried quiet power without needing a crowd to recognize it. I used to wish you had a regular job, she said, like something easy to explain. Renee laughed. I know. I could see in your face when people asked. But now I think it's cool. Like really cool. Renee reached out and gently tucked one of her daughter's braids behind her ear. I'm proud of you. You know, she said, not because of what you said in class, but because you said it anyway. Talia felt a warmth in her chest. Not just pride, but relief. A weight she hadn't noticed until it started to lift. I didn't think you were going to come that day, she admitted. Renee raised an eyebrow. Why not? I thought maybe you'd think it wasn't worth it. Renee paused. Then she leaned in closer, her voice firm and steady. Anything that messes with how you see yourself, that's always worth showing up for. They didn't need to say much after that. Talia stood and walked over to the fridge, grabbed a magnet, and pinned her drawing right next to the grocery list. Renee watched, her heart full but quiet. Not every lesson came with applause. Some just sat there, visible only to the people who'd earned them. But there was one last thing left to say, not for Talia, but for everyone else still learning what brilliance looks like. The next week, during morning announcements, Miss Lawson did something unexpected. She held up a student submission from the Career Dreams bulletin board and read it out loud to the class. This one is from Talia Jefferson, she said. She wrote, I want to build machines that go to places no person has ever been, because someone has to figure out how to get us there. And I think I can. There was no laughter this time, just stillness. A few students turned to look at her, not with disbelief, but something closer to respect. Talia sat at her desk, calm, focused, drawing small gears in the margins of her notebook. She didn't need to look up. She didn't need the room to cheer. That wasn't the point, because this story was never about applause. It was about truth, about being sure of something when everyone else questions it, about what it means to speak boldly, not to be loud, but to be honest. The people in that classroom had seen something they weren't expecting. A woman with credentials, yes. But more than that, a woman who knew who she was, who didn't wait for permission to be heard. And a daughter who watched her walk into a room where belief had already left and still filled it with power. Renee never had to raise her voice. She never had to list her accomplishments. She showed up, and that was enough. But it was Talia who carried the weight of that day. She walked through the fire of ridicule, stood in it, and came out the other side taller. Sometimes the hardest thing to do is believe in yourself out loud, especially when no one else is clapping. And the lesson here isn't just about what job a parent has or how impressive their title sounds. The lesson is about what we teach our children, not with our mouths, but with our actions. When you believe in your child, you give them armor. When you show up for them, you give them courage. When you stand beside them, even for just a few minutes in a crowded room, you show them what being heard actually feels like. And when that happens, when a child feels seen not just by a teacher or a classmate, but by the world, they stop shrinking themselves. They stop second-guessing. They start walking like they've got something important to say. Because they do. Talia didn't need to convince anyone anymore. She wasn't waiting for the class to believe her. She had already moved on, focused now on what she believed possible. That's what makes stories like hers matter. Because for every kid who's laughed at, dismissed, or talked over, there's another moment waiting. When the door opens, when the badge flashes, when silence becomes respect, and it stays with them. At the end of the school year, when the class made their memory book, there was a page labeled Most Likely To. Under Talia's photo, someone had written, Most likely to launch something into space. She smiled when she saw it. Not because it sounded cool, because this time they actually meant it. So the next time a child tells you something bold, don't rush to doubt. Don't reduce them to what you understand. Let them grow beyond what you expect. And if you're a parent watching this, show up, even when it's uncomfortable, especially when it counts. Believe them out loud. Subscribe for more stories like this. It really motivates us to bring you more inspiring and meaningful moments.